Pull out an old family photo album from the 1970s, and the reaction is almost always the same. A mixture of genuine affection and immediate, uncontrollable laughter. There is your father in a suit made entirely of a fabric that seems to glow faintly under any light source. There is your mother's hair, teased and feathered into a shape that appears to defy several laws of physics. There are collars wide enough to double as small wings. None of this looked strange at the time. It looked, to the people wearing it, like the height of modern style. Understanding exactly how an entire decade of Americans ended up dressed this way, and precisely why almost none of it survived into the following decade in its original form, is a genuinely interesting story about economics, chemistry, culture, and the strange, cyclical logic of fashion itself. The wall-to-wall polyester takeover was not simply a matter of bad taste, but traces directly to a specific global economic event. Polyester and other synthetic double-knit fabrics dominated 1970s clothing to an extent that can be hard to fully appreciate now. Suits, shirts, dresses, and even bed sheets manufactured from petroleum-based synthetic fiber that held color vividly, resisted wrinkling, and could be mass-produced considerably more cheaply than natural fibers like cotton or wool, once manufacturing technology matured through the late 1960s and early 1970s. This synthetic fiber boom coincided directly with a period of relatively cheap, abundant petroleum, the raw material from which polyester is manufactured, making synthetic fabric an economically attractive alternative to natural fibers for both manufacturers and budget-conscious consumers throughout the earlier part of the decade. The 1973 oil embargo, imposed by OPEC nations in response to Western support for Israel during the Yom Kippur War, quadrupled oil prices in a matter of months, a documented economic shock that directly raised the production cost of petroleum-derived synthetic fabrics considerably faster than the cost of natural fiber alternatives. This price shift genuinely altered the underlying economics that had made polyester such an attractive, affordable fabric choice throughout the earlier part of the decade, contributing to a gradual industry shift back toward natural and blended fabrics through the later 1970s and into the 1980s, a change traceable directly to global energy markets, rather than simply a sudden collective realization that the fabric looked unflattering. The leisure suit represented the absolute peak of this synthetic fabric moment, and its collapse traces to a specific, well-documented cultural backlash rather than gradual fading taste. The leisure suit, a matching jacket and trouser set typically manufactured from polyester double-knit fabric, worn without a necktie, and often paired with wide, pointed shirt collars laid open over the jacket lapels, became an enormously popular alternative to the traditional business suit throughout the mid-1970s. Marketed specifically as a more relaxed, comfortable option suited to the era's broader cultural shift toward informality. Its association with disco culture and nightlife made it a genuinely mainstream fashion staple for several years running. The leisure suit's decline connects directly to the documented cultural backlash against disco culture broadly, culminating dramatically in the widely covered Disco Demolition Night held at Chicago's Comiskey Park in July 1979, where a promotional event inviting fans to destroy disco records descended into a full stadium riot, an event frequently cited by cultural historians as a visible, symbolic marker of disco's rapid fall from mainstream popularity. As disco's cultural association shifted from trendy to embarrassing within a remarkably short period, the specific fashion most closely associated with it, including the leisure suit, fell out of favor correspondingly quickly, a pattern fashion historians describe as a textbook case of a trend collapsing alongside the specific subculture it had become inseparably identified with, rather than through any gradual, independent decline in the garment's own popularity. Platform shoes climbed to genuinely extreme heights during the decade, and their decline traces partly to documented safety concerns alongside a broader shift in style sensibility. Platform shoes, featuring a thick, elevated sole running the entire length of the shoe rather than simply a raised heel, became enormously popular across both men's and women's fashion throughout the decade, with some extreme examples reaching several inches in total height, worn at discos, in everyday street fashion, and even in some workplace settings. Documented medical and safety concerns accumulated around these extreme platform styles, including a genuinely notable increase in ankle sprains and related injuries reported by podiatrists treating patients whose shoes offered a considerably less stable base and reduced ankle mobility compared to conventional footwear. The subsequent punk and new wave fashion movements, emerging in the later 1970s, deliberately rejected the elaborate, maximalist aesthetic that platform shoes represented, favoring instead a starker, more minimalist visual style built around simpler silhouettes. As these subcultures gained mainstream visibility moving into the 1980s, platform shoes retreated from everyday fashion into a considerably more niche, occasional use category, only periodically resurfacing in more moderate form during later fashion revival cycles, rather than maintaining anything resembling their original 1970s mainstream ubiquity. Wide lapels and oversized collars dominated both men's and women's fashion, and their disappearance traces to a documented shift in tailoring standards driven by the following decade's changing workplace culture. Shirt and jacket collars throughout the 1970s grew considerably wider and more pointed than either the preceding or following decades, a tailoring trend that extended across nearly every category of clothing, from formal business attire to casual shirts worn with the leisure suits already discussed. This exaggerated silhouette reflected the broader maximalist visual sensibility running through much of the decade's fashion. The rise of a considerably more conservative, tailored corporate dress aesthetic through the 1980s, closely associated with the era's expanding financial and corporate sectors, and often summarized under the broader cultural label of power dressing, favored slimmer lapels, narrower collars, and a more streamlined overall silhouette intended to project professional seriousness rather than the relaxed informality the 1970s aesthetic had celebrated. This documented shift in corporate fashion culture, driven partly by the rapid growth of the American finance and business sector during the 1980s, and the specific visual identity that sector cultivated, directly reshaped mainstream tailoring standards away from the wide, exaggerated proportions of the previous decade. Earth tone color palettes saturated both fashion and home design throughout the decade, and their decline connects to a documented cyclical shift in color trend research. Avocado green, harvest gold, burnt orange, and deep brown dominated not just clothing, but kitchen appliances, carpeting, and home furnishings throughout the 1970s, a color palette closely associated with the decade's broader aesthetic identity, and one that color and design trend forecasters have extensively documented as reflecting a specific cultural mood of the period, an association with nature, warmth, and a countercultural rejection of the brighter, more artificial-feeling colors popular in the preceding decade. Color trend research, conducted by industry groups including the Color Marketing Group, has repeatedly documented that mainstream color preference genuinely cycles on a roughly decade-long rhythm, driven partly by simple visual fatigue after prolonged saturation, and partly by each new generation's documented tendency to define its own aesthetic identity in deliberate contrast to the immediately preceding one. The shift toward the brighter jewel tones and stark black and white contrasts that characterized 1980s fashion and design represents a well-documented example of this broader color cycle pattern, a genuine, traceable trend rhythm, rather than simply the earth tone palette having been an inherently flawed choice from the outset. The elaborately feathered hairstyle, popularized by television and film during the decade, required a specific combination of technology and cultural conditions that shifted considerably in the years that followed. The feathered, layered hairstyle that became enormously popular through the middle of the decade depended heavily on the growing household availability of powerful handheld hair dryers and curling technology that had only recently become widely affordable, accessible to ordinary consumers. Technology that made achieving this specific, voluminous, face-framing shape considerably more practical for everyday styling than it would have been using earlier decades' more limited home hair care tools. The style's decline connects to several documented factors, including the broader shift in television and film's dominant style icons moving into the 1980s toward different silhouettes, and the introduction of new styling technology, including improved curling iron designs and eventually crimping irons that made considerably different hair shapes practical for home styling. Hairstyling trend researchers have also pointed to the simple, cyclical nature of hairstyle fashion generally, where any style that achieves truly widespread saturation across an entire population tends to generate an eventual backlash, specifically because of its very ubiquity, a documented pattern across multiple decades of American hairstyle trend history, rather than something unique to this particular style. Bell-bottom and flare-leg jeans defined the decade's silhouette for both men and women, and their disappearance and later periodic return traced to a well-documented pattern of denim industry trend cycling. The wide, flared leg silhouette that dominated jeans and trousers throughout the decade grew directly out of a late 1960s countercultural fashion trend that gradually moved into mainstream retail production throughout the 1970s, manufactured at massive commercial scale by major denim producers responding to genuinely enormous consumer demand for the style across the entire decade. The silhouette's decline through the late 1970s and into the 1980s traces to the denim industry's well-documented pattern of periodically resetting its dominant silhouette to maintain sales momentum, since a market fully saturated with one style eventually requires manufacturers to introduce a meaningfully different silhouette to generate renewed purchasing interest, a pattern denim industry analysts have repeatedly documented across multiple subsequent decades. Straight leg and slim fit styles dominating the 1980s, considerably looser fits returning during the 1990s, and skinny styles becoming dominant through the 2000s and 2010s, before wide leg and flare silhouettes, closely echoing the original 1970s shape, returned to mainstream popularity again during the 2020s. A well-documented cyclical pattern that fashion industry researchers describe as an inherent feature of how denim trends move, rather than a permanent verdict on any single silhouette's inherent appeal. Tie-dye clothing carried a specific countercultural association during the decade that faded considerably once the style moved into full mainstream commercial production. Tie-dye's popularity throughout the 1970s traced directly back to its strong association with the counterculture and psychedelic movement of the preceding decade, worn as a visible marker of a specific cultural and political identity for much of its early popularity. As the style moved into mass commercial production and mainstream retail throughout the decade, sold at scale by conventional clothing manufacturers with no connection to its original countercultural meaning, the garment's cultural significance shifted considerably, eventually becoming associated more with generic, mass-produced novelty than with any specific cultural statement. This pattern, a style closely associated with a specific subculture, eventually losing its original cultural meaning once mass commercial production adopts it at scale, is a documented phenomenon fashion sociologists refer to as trend diffusion, where mainstream commercial adoption of a subcultural style tends to simultaneously boost its short-term sales volume while eroding the original cultural significance that made it meaningful to its earliest adopters, ultimately shortening rather than extending the trend's overall cultural relevance and contributing to its eventual retreat from mainstream fashion by the following decade. Gold chains and deeply open shirt collars on men reflected a specific, well-documented shift in masculine style codes that did not persist into the following decade's considerably more conservative aesthetic. Men's fashion throughout the middle of the decade embraced a considerably more open, revealing style than either the preceding or following decades. Shirts worn unbuttoned well below the chest, often paired with visible gold chain necklaces, a style closely associated with disco culture, and broader shifts in how mainstream masculinity was visually represented during this specific period. The considerably more conservative, buttoned-up corporate aesthetic that took hold through the 1980s, again closely tied to the documented rise of power dressing and the visual culture of the era's expanding corporate and financial sectors, directly reversed this trend, favoring fully buttoned shirts, neckties, and a generally more covered, formal presentation of professional masculinity. This shift connects to the same broader corporate culture change regarding lapels and collars, a single, well-documented cultural pivot toward corporate formality that reshaped multiple separate elements of 1970s men's fashion simultaneously as the decade turned over. The jumpsuit, worn across both casual and disco-adjacent settings throughout the decade, faded from mainstream fashion for reasons tied to both practicality and a broader silhouette shift. The one-piece jumpsuit, cinched at the waist and often made from the same synthetic double-knit fabrics dominating the rest of the decade's fashion, offered a distinctly modern, streamlined alternative to separate tops and trousers, worn widely by both men and women across casual and evening settings throughout the middle of the decade. Its single-piece construction carried a genuine practical drawback that later became more widely discussed in fashion commentary. The garment's structure made simple tasks like using a restroom considerably more inconvenient than separate clothing items, a practical friction point that likely contributed, alongside broader changing silhouette preferences, to its retreat from everyday mainstream fashion by the following decade, even as it has periodically resurfaced in more tailored, structured form during later fashion revival cycles. Corduroy fabric saturated casual fashion throughout the decade in a pattern closely tied to the same broader natural versus synthetic fiber cycle already discussed regarding polyester. Wide wale corduroy trousers and jackets became an enormously popular casual wardrobe staple throughout the 1970s, offering a natural cotton-based alternative that fit within the decade's broader aesthetic embrace of earth tones and textured, tactile fabric. As fashion moved into the 1980s, alongside the broader shift toward slimmer corporate tailoring already discussed, corduroy's specifically wide wale, textured casual identity fell out of step with the era's preference for smoother, more structured fabric, retreating into a smaller niche category rather than disappearing outright, and periodically resurging in narrower wale, more tailored form during later decades' fashion cycles. Men's grooming trends, including thick mustaches and permed hair, followed a documented cultural shift away from the specific style icons who had popularized them. Thick, prominent mustaches and permed or heavily styled hair for men became widely popular throughout the decade, closely associated with a specific set of television, film, and music celebrities whose look dominated the era's popular visual culture. As mainstream masculine style icons shifted considerably through the 1980s toward the cleaner, more corporate adjacent look already discussed in connection with fashion's broader power dressing shift, facial hair and hairstyling trends for men shifted correspondingly, favoring a more clean-cut, close-cropped presentation that stood in fairly deliberate contrast to the previous decade's fuller, more elaborate grooming styles. A documented pattern of grooming trends following the same broader generational contrast cycle already discussed regarding color and silhouette trends generally. Velour and heavily textured knit shirts became a defining casual staple of the decade, and their decline connects to the same broader synthetic fabric cost shift already discussed regarding polyester generally. Velour pullover shirts, prized for their soft, plush texture and rich, saturated color options, became a widely popular casual wardrobe staple throughout the middle of the decade. Manufactured predominantly from synthetic fiber blends that benefited from the same cheap petroleum-based production costs supporting the broader polyester boom already discussed. As the same 1973 oil price shock that reshaped polyester economics rippled through the broader synthetic textile industry, velour production costs rose correspondingly, while changing fashion silhouette preferences moving into the 1980s favored the smoother, more structured fabric already discussed in connection with corduroy and corporate tailoring, together contributing to velour's retreat from mainstream casual fashion by the following decade. Behavioral and psychological research into fashion trend cycles offers a useful, evidence-based framework for understanding why virtually every element of 1970s style declined on a broadly similar timeline. Consumer psychology researchers studying fashion adoption patterns have repeatedly documented a phenomenon sometimes called trend fatigue, a measurable decline in a style's perceived appeal once it reaches sufficiently widespread, near-universal adoption across a population, a pattern distinct from simple boredom and rooted instead in documented research on novelty perception and social signaling, where a style's appeal partly depends on its ability to distinguish the wearer, an ability that mathematically diminishes as adoption approaches saturation. This research helps explain why so many distinct elements of 1970s fashion, fabric choice, silhouette, color palette, and hairstyle alike, declined on a broadly overlapping timeline moving into the 1980s, since a decade defined by such thoroughly saturated, near-universal adoption of its signature look was, according to this research, already approaching the natural limit of that specific aesthetic's ability to feel fresh or distinctive to the people wearing it, regardless of any of the other specific economic or cultural factors already discussed. This same body of research also explains the well-documented cyclical return of once embarrassing trends decades later, since sufficient time passing allows a style to lose its direct association with the specific generation that wore it originally, permitting a new generation to encounter the same silhouette or color palette as genuinely novel, rather than as an uncomfortable reminder of an immediately preceding and therefore socially undesirable era. A documented pattern fashion trend forecasters typically describe operating on a cycle of roughly 20 to 30 years between a trend's original decline and its eventual mainstream revival. Disco-associated evening wear more broadly, beyond the leisure suit specifically, followed the exact same collapse trajectory as the subculture it was built around, a pattern worth examining as its own distinct case. Shimmering, metallic, and heavily sequined evening fabrics, worn by both men and women specifically for nightclub and disco settings throughout the middle of the decade, represented an entire separate category of 1970s fashion built explicitly around a specific nightlife culture rather than everyday wear. Unlike the broader fabric and silhouette trends already discussed, which declined gradually across several overlapping causes, disco evening wear's collapse was considerably more sudden and complete, tracking almost exactly alongside disco music's own rapid mainstream decline, following the backlash already discussed. Since this particular category of clothing had essentially no everyday practical use outside the specific cultural context that had originally made it desirable, leaving it with no secondary purpose to fall back on once that specific context disappeared from popular culture. Workplace dress code changes throughout the following decades represent a final, broad, structural factor, explaining why so many 1970s trends specifically could not simply persist as acceptable everyday options. Beyond the specific corporate power dressing shift already discussed regarding tailoring, many American workplaces throughout the 1980s and beyond adopted increasingly formalized written dress code policies, a documented trend in American employment practices that grew partly out of expanding corporate human resources departments and partly out of a broader cultural shift toward more standardized, professionalized workplace presentation generally. These formal policies frequently excluded specific 1970s staples explicitly: open collars, visible chest jewelry, and overly casual synthetic fabrics among them, embedding what had previously been an informal cultural shift in taste into actual written company policy, a documented institutional mechanism that helped ensure these particular styles could not simply drift back into mainstream professional acceptability the way some other trend elements eventually did in casual settings. Taken together, the fashion of the 1970s was never simply a collective, unexplainable lapse in taste, but a coherent set of styles shaped by specific, traceable, economic, cultural, and technological conditions unique to that particular decade. The oil crisis reshaping fabric economics, the disco backlash reshaping an entire category of associated style, the rise of corporate power dressing reshaping tailoring standards, documented safety concerns reshaping footwear, and the simple, well-researched, cyclical nature of trend fatigue across color, hairstyle, and denim silhouette all work together, each pulling in a broadly similar direction, away from the loud, maximalist, synthetic-heavy aesthetic that had defined the decade at its peak. None of these individual factors alone fully explains the complete shift, but together they form a genuinely coherent, well-documented picture of why an entire decade's dominant fashion identity could rise so quickly to near universal adoption and then recede so thoroughly within just a few years afterward. It is worth noting, looking at the pattern honestly, that very little of what defined 1970s fashion has actually disappeared permanently. Flared denim returned to mainstream popularity within the last several years. Platform shoes periodically resurface in more moderate form, and earth-tone color palettes have made a genuine documented comeback in recent home design trend cycles. What actually happened was never a permanent rejection of these specific styles, but the same cyclical trend pattern fashion researchers have documented across nearly every decade. A look rises, saturates completely, retreats once its association with a specific cultural moment fades, or turns embarrassing in hindsight. And then, often decades later, returns again to a new generation who experience it as fresh rather than as an echo of something their own parents once wore, without a hint of irony. Oversized aviator sunglasses and wide, heavy belts rounded out the decade's signature silhouette. And both accessories followed their own distinct, documented decline pattern, tied to shifting eyewear technology and tailoring proportions. Large, heavily tinted aviator-style sunglasses, often worn with correspondingly oversized frames, regardless of actual prescription need, became a near-universal accessory throughout the decade, popularized partly through their association with the era's dominant film and music celebrities, and partly through genuine advances in lightweight frame manufacturing that made larger lens sizes considerably more comfortable and practical for everyday wear than bulkier, earlier eyewear designs had allowed. Wide belts, often featuring large, decorative buckles, served a similarly prominent role, cinching the era's looser-fitting trousers and dresses at the waist in a way that visually anchored the otherwise voluminous silhouette common throughout the decade's fashion. Both accessories declined, for reasons directly tied to the broader silhouette shift already discussed moving into the 1980s. As tailoring standards shifted toward the slimmer, more streamlined corporate look associated with power dressing, the correspondingly oversized eyewear and heavy belt buckles that had visually complemented the 1970s looser, more voluminous clothing silhouette no longer matched the following decade's considerably more fitted proportions, prompting eyewear and accessory manufacturers to correspondingly scale down toward smaller, more understated designs that better suited the new decade's slimmer overall aesthetic. A documented pattern of accessory sizing following clothing silhouette trends that fashion historians have traced across multiple subsequent decades of style transition. So the next time an old photograph draws a laugh at the dinner table, it is worth remembering that nothing in it was actually a mistake. It was a snapshot of an entire economy, an entire culture, and an entire generation's sense of style, all reacting in real time to forces considerably larger than any single person's individual fashion choice. Forces that, given enough time, tend to circle right back around again.